The Indian subcontinent, historically one of the wealthiest places on our planet. Its history filled with great leaders, battles, and empires. Exiting its medieval age, it was at the height of prosperity. Yet the higher you are, the further you have to fall. And over 2.5 centuries, the subcontinent's independence would be stripped, subjugated not by a country, but by a company. This is not a tale of imperial might and conquest, but of merchants, mercenaries, and mismanagement. So join us for this historical tale of how the British East India Company conquered India. When Vasco da Gama first arrived on the subcontinent in the late 16th century, the idea that it would one day be ruled by Europeans could not have been further from the truth. It's easy to forget when looking through the lens of history, but the region is truly massive, and at the time of contact, it was entering its golden age. India was a place of immeasurable wealth, with vast industries for developing fine silks and harvesting cotton and sugar. Indian ports grew rich off their intermediary position in the prosperous spice trade, and agricultural expansions saw the population eclipse 150 million people by the turn of the century. By contrast, early contact between Dutch and Portuguese merchants with the empires on the subcontinent truly shows just how stacked the deck was against them. The Europeans stood in awe of the grand court cities and their production capacity. The European merchants had little, if anything, of interest to the local Indian rulers, except for gold and silver. Yet at the same time, they were pouring vast resources into merchant fleets to access the Indian market. The trading outposts they did establish were a far cry from any true colonial aspiration. These factories, as they were called, were established only with express permission of the local Indian ruler, and should the Europeans step out of line, they could, and would, be suppressed. To add insult to injury, the English were coming up short in the competition of trading companies. The Portuguese had taken an early lead, and the Dutch focused their efforts on monopolizing the spice trade in the East Indies. England, however, could only boast limited bases in the cities of Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. By the 18th century, they also had to compete with France's growing interest in the region. Luckily, they were able to establish a working relationship with the ailing Mughal Empire after checking the Portuguese at sea. But the Mughals weren't the preeminent power they once were. Despite once ruling nearly the entire region, they had declined greatly. So, what was actually going on in India by 1756? The Mughal collapse saw the birth of many independent states, and a new empire on the rise. The Marathas looked to claim the region for themselves, but they would soon suffer a disastrous defeat by the Afghans to the north, halting their momentum and leaving the power vacuum unfilled. Some theorize that, without European intervention, this could have seen the subcontinent permanently split into multiple regional powers. However, building tensions in the northeast would soon culminate the following year, altering the fate of India forever. Siraj-ud-Dowla was at the mercy of his economy, as he held on to power by a thread. The complex web of creditors and merchants which backed him held a chain around his throne, the Nawab of Bengal. So in response, he demanded loans from the financial investors that backed his nation. The British East India Company, being one of them, rejected this offer, and, fearing the consequences, began fortifying their trade port of Calcutta. Ironically, this military buildup was seen as a threat, and convinced the Siraj to quickly overwhelm the city with a larger force. What happened next is subject to vigorous debate. What is suspected is that the British soldiers, Indian sepoys, and some civilians were thrown into a tight prison chamber, where they were kept overnight, with many dying of heat exhaustion and suffocation. The initially believed numbers were 146 prisoners, with 123 dead. However, a more agreed upon number in the modern day amounts to 44 dead, of a lesser prisoner count. Regardless, what would become known as the Black Hole of Calcutta created an image of suffering which filled the minds of the British living in India, and revenge became inevitable. 1757 saw the British under Robert Clive move against Siraj, who had now allied with the French. Their minuscule expedition met the Bengal army of about 50,000 at Plassey. Despite their overwhelming disadvantage, the 3,000-strong force of British and Sepoy forces pulled out a victory due to a large number of Siraj's troops defecting as the British bribed his second-in-command. After this defeat, the East India Company's mission to secure stability of their Bengal trade saw them increasingly become invested in the state's politics, turning it into their protectorate. The conflict in Bengal also ran parallel to world events, as the British Empire found itself embroiled in the 7 Years' War. Much like the rest of the war, the French were unable to achieve much overseas success, as their attempted capture of British Madras was repulsed in 1760, and the following year saw the fall of their headquarters at Pondicherry after a grueling siege. Although French ports would be returned at the end of the war, they would be forbidden from erecting forts or keeping troops on the continent, and were forced to recognize British allies and subordinates in India, which would soon sweep the Carnatic region from their control. Back in Bengal, increasing company intervention in state affairs worried the new Nawab. Not wanting to become a mere vassal, Mir Qasim would withdraw his court to the state of Bahir, rebuild his army, and demand the withdrawal of the company from internal politics. The company simply responded by declaring Qasim deposed and installing a new Nawab, evidently hoping Qasim would simply shut up. Qasim would not take this lying down, and created an anti-British coalition, including many powerful states, and most importantly, the Mughal emperor himself. However, this power didn't necessarily translate to the field, with battle joined at Buxar in 1764. The coalition was defeated by a company force half its size, as the three primary armies were unable to coordinate. With British power secured in Bengal, and the Mughal emperor cowed, the company's power began to rapidly expand. Now, there is no one way to explain why this expansion occurred, but the general overview is that as administrative and military expenditures continued to increase, the East India Company needed growing sources of revenue to fuel their ever-increasing trade. This required stability and predictability, which was not often found on the subcontinent in the wake of the Mughal collapse. States that posed a threat to the company's or their merchants' operations, states whose instability could theoretically destabilize a region, or even states that just posed as a strategic interest for the company to secure, were all swallowed by the ever-growing empire. This, however, once again put the East India Company in direct competition with many other powers on the subcontinent. The Kingdom of Mysore in 1766 was the preeminent state in southern India, and its ruler, Hyder Ali, sought to continue its expansion. 1767 saw the First Anglo-Mysore War, in which Ali's forces rolled over the British and Hyderabad alliance, almost capturing the city of Madras itself. However, a second war would see the tide turn against him, and he would die halfway through. His son, Tipu Sultan, already on campaign, would continue the fight until 1784, when both sides, thoroughly exhausted, decided on a treaty of status quo antebellum. Tipu Sultan was a man much like his father, and thus, when the British ally of Travancore seized some territory in dispute, he responded with an invasion. However, he underestimated his enemy's defenses, and by 1792, he had been driven back to his capital at Seringapatam. Tipu would sue for peace, and be forced into a humiliating treaty, which saw around half of his kingdom split between the British and their allies. But this did not cow his ambition. Instead, he spent the next half-decade rebuilding his army, centralizing his state, and making diplomatic overtures to revolutionary France. In 1798, the East India Company saw fit to do away with any threat to their power in the south, especially any potential ally of the French, and launched a three-pronged invasion of Mysore. The British Maratha Hyderabad coalition, led by Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, lay siege to Seringapatam the following year. Tipu would die defending his city, after allegedly refusing advice to escape in secret. Mysore would once again be split, and what remained was placed thoroughly under company oversight. Tipu's resistance would go on to cement him as a prominent, if not controversial, icon in India's history. With this conquest, the East India Company was left with one other major power on the continent, the Maratha Confederacy. The Marathas by this point weren't a unified empire, instead being a federation of 5 chiefs. This, of course, led to an ample amount of disputes over leadership, which had already led to conflict in the First Anglo-Maratha War in 1775. In this war, the company installed Peshwa was ousted, but his son carried on the claim to power. Despite obtaining the Peshwa throne, the Maratha Confederacy was dealing with internal power struggles, and he sought protection from his father's British allies. In this endeavor, he placed himself in a subservient role to the company, and ceded territory to them. This was unacceptable to the other chiefs, leading to a second, more decisive war in 1803. Three chiefs raised their armies and met company forces, but their inability to unify saw them individually defeated in multiple campaigns. The resulting influence of the company over the negotiations saw major cessions of land, and even concessions from the chief who had stayed neutral during the conflict. By all means, this was the death blow to the Marathas. It was just a matter of time. The death toll itself came 15 years later, as increased company interference in internal affairs led the three chiefs to raise their banners one last time. However, the company now spanned the majority of the subcontinent, and were able to bring over 100,000 men to bear. The Marathas fought hard, but were eventually defeated. The end of this war would mean the end of the Confederacy, and the East India Company were finally the undisputed rulers of India. By 1820, the East India Company sat at their greatest height, continuing to expand into their lesser neighbors and either directly or indirectly administering almost the entire subcontinent. Yet in the mountainous north lay one empire which even the British refused to meddle with. The Sikh Empire was forged out of a collection of Sikh bands in the Punjab region by Ranjit Singh, and this militant origin birthed the strongest native army the British were yet to face. Trained by French and Italian mercenaries, and equipped with the best weapons the world could offer, they boasted a force of 45,000 infantry, 800 artillery pieces, and 26,000 cavalry. Yet despite their grand army, it couldn't withstand the death of its leader. The political instability that followed Singh's death, and the British military buildup adjacent to the empire, saw rising tensions between the two until they came to a head in 1845, when a small portion of the Sikh army crossed the Sanjet River. The company had mobilized 54,000 men, or an entire fifth of their fighting force, to counter the Sikh threat. The Sikhs, however, did not attack, instead negating the collective strength of their army by maintaining a defensive posture for most of the war. They were pushed further and further back, until the capital of Lahore fell in 1846. With this defeat, the British seized the region of Jammu and Kashmir, but the Sikhs remained with their nominal independence. This arrangement would only last for 2 years, however, as 1848 saw dual rebellions in Multan and Lahore against growing British influence. Here too, the Sikhs' more defensive posture aided in their downfall, despite both sides sustaining heavy casualties. The following year saw the British annex Punjab and eliminate the last real threat to their hegemony. However, there is a problem with using these armed conflicts to define the British conquest of India, in that they were the exception, and not the rule. The British East India Company's main objective was to make money off the trade in the Indian market, and conquest would result in rising costs in military presence, administration, and other factors of running an empire. Many company members saw it fit to halt the company's territorial expansion, as the more they conquered, the more they would have to invest into securing their conquests in the aftermath. By 1806, the company debts were approaching £30 million in today's metrics. Even in victory, war was a costly adventure, and the threat of losing even a single battle was often enough to convince the company to pursue other means of subjugation. After the annexation of Bengal, the company had the diplomatic and economic prowess to throw its weight around, subjugating smaller states into becoming subsidiaries. In these agreements, the local ruler would retain their de jure independence, while accepting a company resident which would monitor the state's internal affairs, and house and maintain a detachment of company troops in their territory. Despite this policy's intention of limiting administrative costs, it ended up only fueling company expansion, as the rising costs soon saw the subsidiaries falling into inefficient and unstable government practices. This saw the continued attempts of imperial consolidation of the acquired territories, which would only slow down once there were no remaining threats to the company's stability left on the subcontinent. Rounding out this absorption of territory were the policies of Lord Dalhousie, who served from 1848 to 1856, and is credited with the creation of the Doctrine of Lapse, which saw at least 7 new states brought under direct administration. Here the borders solidified into what they would be until India's independence nearly a century later. So how did the British conquer India? Slowly, and almost reluctantly. In the beginning, they used their connection to the British markets to grow fabulously wealthy off the Indian trade, and when this was threatened by Bengal, they took it over to secure the cash flow. Soon, with every expedition and alliance, they were forced to grow larger and larger to maintain stability over their empire, as they made more and more enemies. Their advantage in this middle stage was their ability to employ large numbers of sepoys, trained by British officers, to employ one of the most efficient armies on the continent, and make allies with key regional powers using their economic influence. Finally, during the wars against the Marathas and Sikhs, they had already surpassed the other powers on the subcontinent, and were able to field larger, more unified, and better trained armies against their opponents. The company nearly conquered India out of necessity, stemming from their want to stable profits. As they expanded, it only led to more instability and rising costs, which fueled further expansion. Of course, the pursuit of profit and the British belief in their cultural superiority saw increasing neglect of their conquered subjects' needs. 1769 saw the Great Bengal Famine, where estimates of between 1 and 7 million people died due to crop failure and company neglect and mismanagement. The British pillaged Bengal and their other further conquests of artifacts and other plunder to make their personal fortunes. Regular agriculture, which previously maintained India's large population, was partially phased out in favor of cash crops. Famously, the EIC's opium trade would lead to the wars that brought the Qing to their knees, further expanding British influence in Asia. They were a disastrous administrative force to the people of India. And whether it be a subcontinent-wide rebellion, finally forcing the British Crown to annex the territory from the company, or the independence movement in the succeeding century, the inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent would never come to terms with their own subjugation, and would yearn for independence once more. Thank you so much for waiting so long. I really hope you've enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching. This took forever to make, and I'll probably go for something more my speed next video. I'm always open to suggestions, so drop them in the comments, and until next time, please subscribe. This is the Chronology Cast, signing off.